small groups of people coming together can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that tends to change the world.
Welcome back, everyone, to our Beyond Outcomes podcast. Today, we have a very special guest flown in to us from Ireland. We have Tom Melvin here today with us. Tom, you have a wonderful career with many different facets to it, from medicine to law to being regulatory advisor to being a professor and an overall great person. I really look forward to our conversation today, touching about a lot of topics, clinical trial regulations, especially with a focus on medical devices and what's happening. And you have a lot of insights to share because you talk with many different sides, from students, academics, regulators. I really look forward to our conversation today. So let's pick up there. Tell us, and especially also the audience, a bit about who is Tom Melvin, sort of like what's your background, how did you get into clinical research, and sort of like what's your general perspective informed by most?
Yeah, no, thank you, Andreas. I guess I first became involved in research 11 years ago when I moved from being a hospital doctor. I was a junior doctor on the wards and started work in the Irish regulatory body called HPRA, or the equivalent to BFARM here. It was a very interesting time because medical devices were still regulated under the directive system. So I remember the very first clinical study I was asked to review involved bronchoscope and liquid nitrogen, with the hypothesis that if you freeze the inside of the lung, it'll grow back beautifully. And I guess from seeing some very interesting technologies and some planned protocols, I was a medical officer responsible for reviewing the clinical aspects. I essentially caught a bug for getting into figuring out how do we best frame research? How do we make sure it protects patients and appropriately translates technologies? And it's a topic, I guess, 11 years later, I'm still looking at. So that's, I guess, kind of how I started. At the time, I was, working as a junior doctor and planning to take a year out. So life as a regulator was not planned. But I suppose because of my background in law as well as medicine, once I joined HPRA, I found it very interesting that there was an opportunity to use, I guess, both sets of perspectives. When looking at a technology, you have to make sure it's compliant with the relevant legislation and the rules that apply. You also want it to be good quality research. So it draws to a sense on both of those kind of domains.
And how come you started out in devices? As a doctor, was there already a tie or connection to that? So did you get experience with devices there? Because typically you would be more exposed to the drug side, even though we have much more, use of medical devices, but it feels they're flying a little bit under the radar maybe. So
Yeah.
what was that transition opportunistic because that was a position that was available, or how come you moved into devices?
I guess the latter years of work in the hospital, I was actually working in medical gerontology, or medicine for the elderly. So it's not a very medical technology focused specialism. So it probably wasn't from my clinical day-to-day work. And, because I arrived at the agency, with a fairly open mind, I thought, well, try this and see if it's interesting. And if not, you could go off and do something else. But once I got in and started to look at files and think about the technologies and their evidence, I found it fascinating. But it was a nascent field and arguably still is. So when I would have joined our regulator, I would have been the only medical officer looking after medical devices. Then I have a team of 4 medical officers and a senior medical officer responsible for the area. So it was a small but growing field with very interesting, very new technologies. And it was an opportunity to work across, a number of different life cycle stages, essentially. You'd see the very early things going into clinical studies. We also would have an opportunity to look at vigilance or incident reporting and trying to figure out how do authorities appropriately assess safety in the post-market. So you got to see technologies right through their life course. So I found it fascinating, but I didn't come from one of the more traditional fields like orthopedics or cardiology where you're hands-on and implanting on a daily basis. But I still had a good appreciation for general medicine and ensuring the best overall outcome for patients. And I think medical gerontology is a very nice one in that regard because it really is focused around what is best for that individual patient. And many of the choices you had to make was, looking at the frailty of the patient or their goals for care, what would be the appropriate thing? You could take every patient down and open their chest and replace their heart valve,
Right.
but for many patients, that probably wouldn't have been the best overall decision. So trying to figure out what is the best thing for that individual patient was a really nice thing that I learned from working with gerontology.
Do you think from your, let's say, background as you joined the competent authority, was the medical side more informative over how you approached working for a regulator, or the law side? Because both are clearly prominent in
Yeah.
your position there. So
Yeah.
where did you strike the balance?
With medical devices, something I hear even these days from current assessors is that when you work with medical devices, you're far more reliant on the legislation. When you talk to a medicines assessor, they're often far more interested in the data or the methods. But in the medical device world, it's often trying to find out if whatever the methods are that have been prepared, do they meet a often reasonably generic legal standard? So we have a much greater focus in the medical device world in interpreting and understanding the applicability of the law and then the guidance that sits under it or the standards. So it was one where I didn't think I would need law quite so much, but it turned out that it did become a big part of the job. And within about a month of starting, I would have started work as a regulator in March 2015. By about April 2015, I was going to Brussels because the MDR was still being negotiated. So again, I guess the background in law was helpful because I got to join some of the Irish delegation for European Council meetings where they were having to end negotiations for the regulations. So that was a really interesting experience. But when I was leaving law and going into medicine, I thought, that's it, I'll park that now. But it did come back and did turn out to be very useful.
Yeah, I can certainly imagine, because at the end of the day, it's interpretation of text written, which is very essential to law, which you have to apply on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
How much of that, especially in your early days, was still, let's say, you negotiating with yourself as you are sort of confronted with the interpretation of a third party, which is the person approaching the regulator, versus
Yeah.
how much and how much did that evolve into you having a general, like, deep understanding of regulations, and therefore sort of being sure in yourself and projecting it outward and setting boundaries? How did that evolve for you?
I think it took about 2 years for me to just understand how the actual architecture of the medical device system fits together. I remember when I went for my interview to become a regulator, I didn't really know what notified bodies were or what they did. I kind of thought that's what the government body did. Medical devices has a complex governance ecosystem. Which we could talk about for many hours, but understanding how all of those cogs work in order to deliver things out the other side of the system, that was, I guess, helped by the legal background, but it did take about 2 years to properly understand how the different parts fitted together and how they performed their functions in the entire framework.
And maybe also for the audience, can you briefly, sort of from your perspective, touch upon the interplay between these players? So you mentioned competent authorities, like we have in Germany the BfArM, for example, and the notified bodies, which are non-governmental for-profit companies that at the end of the day sort of issue CE certifications. How do they interplay? Where is the differentiation also in terms of which is the responsibility of which and who informs whom to which extent?
Yeah. So essentially, if we think through how a device translates from a prototype through to a marketed product, or through trials to a marketed product into the post-market, national competent authorities have the role of looking after pre-market clinical studies. And with the MDR that came, they had responsibility for some post-market studies as well. So that's one of their main jobs, is looking after non-CE marked devices going into clinical studies. Then as you say, for market access, it goes from the 27 competent authorities in the EU member states to about 55 notified bodies. And as you say, these are private organizations. Some operate for profit and some operate on a non-profit basis. Many of them grew out of the national standards bodies that we had. And they look after the market access. When you get to the post-market, there's a bit of a dual responsibility. So if something happens, let's say there's an incident here in Germany, you'd report that to the German authority, or you could report it to the manufacturer. And then periodically, you report to the notified body, or sometimes you also send individual incident reports to the notified body. So it's clean in the pre-market for studies. It's clean for market access, but there is some overlap within the post-market in terms of reporting requirements. Yeah. So it's...
Was that a struggle for you also as you joined? I mean, you said it took you 2 years. There's a reason why it took you 2 years, not because you didn't engage with it.
Those things are reasonably clear, but understanding the governance framework, how does guidance get created, or how do standards work? These both have their own ecosystems to them. So for the medical device and IVD regulations, we have over 100 guidance documents now. So the way that's prepared, it's governed by the Medical Device Coordination Group. So that's a group that meets periodically. It's chaired by the European Commission, so the Santé D3 Directorate. And they would have about maybe 20 or maybe slightly more with the revisions happening, about 20 policy officers or staff in the unit in Brussels. So their job is to bring coordination amongst all these different actors. So you have the Medical Device Coordination Group. You also have a Notified Body Coordination Group. That was a new thing with the regulations. Then you would have another group called the Competent Authorities Medical Device Network, which is a more informal, collaborative way that authorities come together, which would be somewhat similar to the Heads of Medicines Agency group for medicines. And then you have lots of other policy actors in the wider ecosystem. So right now it's very active because there's a proposal to revise the 2 sets of laws. So then you have the Commission, the Parliament and the Council all very active. And then there are different groups on an international level, but the organogram starts to explode out as you start to go through it.
Yeah. Okay, I think you paint a very vivid picture why it takes someone, even from the inside, 2 years to even just unravel who to talk to, who should give guidance or direction here or there. And one of the things that you mentioned is that we have a tremendous body of guidance documents as well. In your role, sort of like as a person working for a competent authority, let's say from an outside perspective, guidance documents, especially everything that's published by the MDCG, is sort of seen as law for us. It's not not formally from a regulatory point of view being, let's say, an EU regulation or embedded in one, not even a directive. It is very clear that adherence to these guidelines is anticipated and expected. I'm assuming the same perspective is shared by competent authorities, and it's helpful for you to have that additional guidance to refer back to.
Yeah. So, under the directive framework, we might have had something in the region of 20 MedDev guidance documents. So things expanded a huge amount. And we're very different to the medicines world in that, if you want to try and deal with a topic like AI in health product regulation, a group like the European Medicines Agency could write a concept paper. Here's the things happening and how we need to think about it, or a reflection paper, and then build towards a guidance, which would be the auditable standard then. In the medical device world, as you say, everything has a generic medical device coordination group nature to it. So we don't, whilst within those MDCG documents, you'll see questions and answers documents or different kinds of things. We only have the one type of formatted document that is published. Sometimes, I remember when we published the old MedDev document for clinical evaluation, a very important guidance. It's from 2016, but a lot of it is still applied today. We had a huge amount of debate at the time about how does this apply? Does this apply now, immediately? Or would this apply in maybe 5 years' time? Or how? So there is a kind of an interesting thing where the date the guidance is published, it could become auditable and you could have findings possibly raised against it. But at the same time, people have to incorporate it into their quality system and into their next clinical evaluation update and that kind of thing. So it does exist in a somewhat grey zone, how these things go out and get implemented under timing. The other challenge, I think, with the MDCG documents is that they're often themselves a result of uh, debate and compromise. So, in a similar way to when you're preparing legislation, it becomes a negotiation amongst the three legislative bodies, Commission, Council, and Parliament. Even when you're making guidance, it often becomes a negotiation to say, we'd like that wording, or we prefer that wording, or sometimes it's almost left deliberately vague. But that can be a really challenging thing for the end user because
Yes.
they're left with a requirement that it's hard to know, do I need to do a study like this or maybe not do a study and write a justification? So I think, it would be a lot better for the system if we could have likely fewer guidance documents that were more focused and the applicability was clearer up front. Um, but I think the mindset that drives a lot of the MDCG guidance documents is to further interpret the law. But I think a different change of mentality where we focus perhaps more on discrete technologies or discrete methodological challenges, I think that would be a nice way to focus some of these guidances and maybe adopt some of the framings that our medicines colleagues have, where we're in bad need of things like a concept paper for things like AI medical devices. So we need to try and better figure out how to build guidance that works for the users and everyone has to implement it. 'Cause it's such a polycentric system that we really have to make sure that the things coming from the top are as clear as they can be.
Adding a layer of complexity, especially I think for the medical device world, on top next to the MDCG, one of the institutes that publishes very relevant guidance is ISO.
Yeah.
So not only is the ISO 14155 standard the one according to which we should conduct clinical investigations, but of course are relevant for how we even gather evidence for our devices. You have numerous guidances also on quality management systems, how to manufacture, and so on. And then for indication-specific guidance in addition. How does that interface with the level of guidance or requirements set forth by regulators in the way that you have observed it? What's the interplay with the ISO group?
Yeah. They're quite distinct, and ISO standards would have a different form of application in that the application of a standard is always voluntary. This was the original conception when they first wrote the directives that you could apply a standard voluntarily or not. If you don't apply the standard, you're supposed to apply something at least equivalent to what's in the standard. Um, I guess a lot of my work tends to focus on clinical evidence and testing in humans. So, as part of a research project in the last couple of years, we went and mapped out all the ISO documents. There's something like 600 to 700 documents in the ISO universe, and they have their own hierarchy. So there's a ISO standard, or you could have a technical specification, a technical report, or a guidance document, and probably other things. Like in the United Kingdom, for example, they have a publicly accessible standard, which could be, made with BSI, but by an independent drafting group. So there's a whole universe to these kind of ISO documents. I think that they serve a very important function for many areas of things like manufacturing control, toxicology or biocompatibility, and things like that, where they are detailed and quite rigorously applied in the sector. But with my kind of clinical interest, when you look across the 200 or so medical device standards that we would have, only a handful of them would have technology-specific clinical requirements. Really, it's only a handful out of the 200. So, we don't have clear clinical evidence rules for things like heart valves or coronary stents. It from the MDCG universe. We also don't get it from the ISO universe. So there is a space where we need to develop these things. We've been very slow in the medical device world because there are legislative instruments. So another type of thing you can write is a common specification. And these were prepared for devices like non-corrective contact lenses or liposuction machines, because the way MDR was written said you had to have those common specifications to market the product, but we haven't developed them for any other general medical device yet. But it would be a really good way to try and clarify and harmonize things like clinical evidence requirements when that's really important for, things like a heart valve, a coronary stent, or continuous glucose meters, or things like that. But we haven't managed to get there yet in the system.
So in the absence of a common standard, how How is the need for clinical evidence derived?
That is one of the key questions. It really is. I got to experience as a regulator the shift from the directive to the medical device regulation.
Mm.
And one of the things that I think was most challenging for those applying the rules was that lots of legal requirements changed. When we went from directive to regulation, there wasn't a single definition that was left untouched. Every definition changed. Clinical data, equivalence, all of these kind of
Mm.
key things. But did the evidence standard improve significantly? There's no evidence that shows that it has gone up or down, to be honest. We did some analysis in a EU-funded project called CoreMD, Coordination of Research and Evidence for High-Risk Devices, and we did systematic reviews across cardiology, orthopedics, and diabetes. And in general, what we found is that the amount of high-quality pre-market clinical studies was quite low. So, even for things like high-risk devices in cardiology, only a very small fraction had a randomized controlled trial either at all, and even less of them had one before CE marking. So this is a real challenge. And if you're a product developer, what you have to do is figure out the language and conceptions of MDR, which is usually based around your intended purpose. What is it that you say this is going to do?
Right.
And then you work backwards to a research hypothesis for how can we justify that.
Right.
But that's a very different way to how clinical trial methodologists usually think. So it does take some time for people working on new product development to figure out the MDR conceptions of how evidence should be framed, and then what is the exact kind of study I'm going to do. That is a real challenge. The system has been designed in such a way that it allows freedom to developers to say, we'll do an observational study or a non-inferiority study or maybe a experimental study with a control group. But that sometimes feels challenging for the developers, even though they have freedom. They're often not quite sure, well, is this sufficient? Will this satisfy the notified body? Will it help us on our journey towards reimbursement and someone paying for our product? And I think this is one of the key challenges in Europe when we compare ourselves to the United States. And I hear this all the time from work in the university. You can go and meet with the US FDA and say, here's our protocol outline. We're thinking a study like this. We're going to put it in here, here, and here, and we're hoping for a broad indication. And FDA will say, that's fine. Or put it here, 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 and here, and we'll give you a broad indication. So you can get that clinical surety at an early stage, which is vital for new product developers because it strengthens their funding pitch. And the challenge in Europe is that we haven't developed sufficiently or pre-market scientific advice in the way that it's done for medicines or in the way it's done in the United States. I hope that's something that will grow. We mapped this last year and found that about 2/3 of authorities, when we surveyed and got results from 19 out of 27, told us that you can have a pre-submission dialogue. You can talk to the regulator. But we weren't able to find any case where you could have a detailed scientific discussion and agree on an endpoint or a study design aspect. So that's currently left unaddressed, but that's one of the most vital areas of support you need to translate your technology with greater confidence. So I think it's a real opportunity for further development in our system.
Why do you think we touch upon a bunch of topics? I'm sure we'll sort them into bite-sized pieces in between. Let's leave evidence behind for now, and let's briefly touch upon, you mentioned sort of the opportunity to exchange with regulators and get opinions. I think one of the elements you touched upon earlier is we have such a system where your trial is competent authority, your approval goes to notified body, and then post-market it's a little bit of a, pick and choose, sort of. Or let's say multiple players are involved. It's not so clearly distinguished. Now, in Europe, you can have something, well, let's say that's framed, you can have a framed exchange with the notified bodies. Yeah, sure. It said you can. It took a long time to really implement it, and there's a lot of hesitancy. It feels that also in the conversations with notified bodies that are at times in attendance of conferences, and if you discuss with them, they are not so sure where the line is between advising too much and staying to their role as controlling body that has been assigned to them. what is the regulatory, from your perspective, the regulatory intention of what the notified body should or shouldn't do, and why, like, what would be the best avenue to bridge this
Mm.
conversation vacuum, which at the moment we really struggle with in Europe?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question and a fundamental issue I think that we currently have in Europe. So structured dialogue is a wonderful term. It was introduced in 2022 and is defined as a dialogue to improve the efficiency and predictability of the conformity assessment process.
Sounds nice.
A wonderful definition. I'm not sure if we're any the more clear on it now that I've given you the definition. But you're exactly right that the parameters of what you can discuss as to the minimal acceptability of your clinical evidence set is unclear. I think in practice, some notified bodies will give you a nod or a wink or some form of steer. There is hesitancy because there has been problems in the past where notified bodies would do things like offer to certify a product just at a client meeting at a very early stage, and they'd say, well, we're going to claim equivalence to this, should that be okay? And they're like, absolutely fine, just sign up with us and we'll get this done in a month or something. So that kind of the challenge with structured dialogue is that there's a hesitancy because of the innate nature of the client-service relationship that a notified body has with a manufacturer. So there's natural hesitancy of trusting that kind of process. So I think that if you want to make this whole early advice work in the complicated EU ecosystem, I think that there are a number of things that could help. People sometimes talk of a single source of truth. Could we at least make sure that the advice being given is consistent around the system? I think things that would empower that is a way of documenting and sharing the outcomes of these structured dialogues. And if it happens in silos, it's going to be very difficult to orchestrate, but our system is kind of drawing us into silos currently. So what could happen is you could have a structured dialogue, there might be a minute of the meeting, but if that's only checked every 5 years by a designating authority who are mostly auditors, and that knowledge is not shared back anywhere centrally, we're not going to be able to grow collectively and get more refined in describing these things. So I think that figuring out some way to have a single source who can at least monitor or oversee the kind of advice happening in the system would be a very useful thing. But I'm not sure if that's on the current implementation table. One of the other challenges we have to remember, though, is that the medical device regulation could be described as being embraced by subjectivism. So if you say, I have clinical data providing sufficient clinical evidence, and if a notified body accepts that, then it's compliant. But it means that we have a system where product A may go through a high-quality clinical study, a randomized controlled trial, and go for CE marking. And product B may claim equivalence and have no clinical evidence and go for CE marking. If notified bodies accept that, it becomes compliant, which is just a very different and conformity-oriented way of thinking about devices compared to, our friends in the medicines world, where safety and efficacy is a much clearer standard with a much more rigorous set of methods and study designs needed to get you there. So I think there's two challenges. It's the polycentric system, where if these advice things happen in silos, recorded in silos, we can't learn. So those silos would have to be broken. But we'd also have to introduce appropriate methods so that people are not just giving advice from the top of their head. That sounds good, do it. We should have a more methodological framework. And I was involved in some work, again, it's that Core MD project, but we did try to produce recommended study designs specifically for high-risk therapeutic implants. So there are the workings of the starting material to get us to a more methodological place in the advice we do give. But I think there's a lot of implementation work needed yet in the system. Yeah.
I think one of the big challenges, but technically one that should be manageable to overcome, because it's the same for other regions in Europe, is that, we have such a vast difference between individual devices that all need to be regulated by one piece of regulatory guidance and framework. And in all of that, we need to address also the high-risk ones, which should have a more structured approach to how evidence is generated, and probably generally have, but we'll come to that topic also, I'm sure, in our conversation today. But the majority of devices on the markets fall into the lower risk
Yeah.
groups.
Yeah.
Sometimes or largely not requiring any evidence, which there is ample reasons not to. If it's like a syringe or
Yeah.
a stethoscope, you shouldn't have to run a study. Like some adherence to technical standards is enough. And then you come into this gray area. So like in the polar opposites of an implantable long-term device versus a stethoscope, it's clear that somewhere in between there's a border where you should start having evidence to put it on the market. And now even within individual devices, and you mentioned this earlier, a key differentiator is what do you claim? So what you need evidence for is what you have on your label.
Yeah.
And that means even if your device is technically the same, if you just say it should do something else or it should only do a part of what it can do, it means you need less evidence for that. So given that complexity, do you feel there is even an opportunity for structured enough guidance to determine the level of evidence, or do you think the topic cannot be approached so generalistic? Because it feels the latter is the current, let's say, default with which we approach it. We need to have device by device decisions. Unfortunately, by a group of 55 different companies, and in that, thousands of people working. So of course you'll have differences.
Yeah. Well, exactly. There will always be intra-assessor differences. Even in a refined system like in the medicines world, people have disagreements over is that method okay, is it acceptable, that kind of thing. I think that when you consider the broad array of technologies, exactly like you said, I tend to think of it in three ways, very much as you described. The high-risk therapeutic implants should be subject to rigorous pre-market clinical studies. I think if you talk to anyone and ask them if you're going to get a heart valve or a neural stent, would you like to have that tested in others before it's implanted in you as a product? People would almost unanimously say yes. But we have a system where we apply the same generic requirement to the wheelchair and stethoscope as to the heart valve. They all must have clinical data providing sufficient clinical evidence. So I think you're right. For certain high-risk therapeutic areas, especially in growing fields where you might have 2 or 3 products available, but another 20 in the pipeline, I think they're important opportunities to try and get minimal clinical evidence requirements clearer. Because that is where we're taking the greatest risk for patients with quite significant uncertainty. So you can run into significant public health challenges, and I saw lots of those in the directive era from the post-market with devices. When you get into the middle zone, so here we might be talking about things like, let's say an insufflator, something that distends your abdomen when you're having surgery. Does that need a clinical study? You could have lots of debates around it or get into debates around what claims they might make, but it's a legitimately difficult question where a conceptual approach alone wouldn't solve it. You would need somewhat of a conceptual approach, but someone has to make the crude policy decision at the end of yes or no, clinical study or not, or a small clinical study. And we, like you're saying, we don't have a central place to get that sense within our system currently. And for the low-risk devices, they can proceed to market generally without clinical study, but there are some exceptions. I remember I saw a product once. It was a class 1 device, but it was marketed for people with acute airway obstruction. There was a number of products, I think a number still are available, but there was a plunger one, or there was one that looked like a shovel that you'd kind of do a Heimlich abdominal thrust maneuver on yourself. And they were often widely marketed, but had as class 1, but had a huge risk attached to them.
Right.
For the plunger one, for example, if you have an acute airway obstruction, the first thing you do is you stand up and bend forward. So you're not going to lie flat on the ground and get a plunger. So these were marketed with no clinical study, or they might have been trialed in a non-clinical or cadaver model or something. But they had a huge public health consequence if they didn't work. So sometimes there's rare exceptions, but in general, that 3 ways of thinking about medical devices is the right one. This is exactly how the United States figured this out in 1969. So back in the 1960s, there were increasing medical devices making their way to the market in the US, but with no rigorous regulation in place. There was rules from 1938, but they didn't have much to say about medical devices. What the US government did at that time is they asked some independent clinician scientists appointed by the national academies to do a report to government. That was called the Cooper Report, and a guy called Theodore Cooper wrote it. And that's why we have the 3 risk classes now, because he said if you're a class 3, you're treated quite like a medicine. Class 2 should comply with standards, and class 1, general controls, register and prepare documents, but no pre-market evidence. So I guess that was a way that helped the US system to be set up in a much more proportionate way to the way that technologies advanced. And if you think about the arc of the last 100 years, it was only from the late 1950s that the highest risk, the class 3s as we think of them today, started to come into widespread clinical use. You know, it was in a short couple of years from 1958 to the early 1960s, we had the first fully implantable heart valve, the first pacemaker, and the first hip replacement implant that was successful, the Charnley implant, which is still available today. And that really changed the requirements of regulation, because we went from the very low-risk stethoscopes and the equipment to implants with therapeutic function. And I think in Europe, we have to try and catch up with that simple delineation to make things clearer for everyone. But our challenge in Europe is that we have the same generic requirement and proportionality is implied.
Right.
But that can make things unclear.
And do you think sort of like a collective growth of decisions, you talked about the decision-making behind closed doors being one of the problems. And also there again, US, I think, is a little bit more transparent. So if you go and look at how devices are registered on the market, you can get the 510K report, for example, and that makes it quite clear what level of evidence was presented, how was it argued, where was an agreement therefore made. Is there any discussion or idea from a regulatory point of view to just say, okay, sure, we might have a high range of different devices and we cannot pre-specify everything, but we can once make a determination and we can simply say this determination is widely applicable and we'll publish it so that everyone that falls under this category has a clearer idea of the requirements that need to be fulfilled, and we can sort of make that a standard without needing to, let's say, like sort or predict what type of devices and what type of questions we'll receive in the future, what type of claims will we receive in the future. We can sort of have it semi-reactive, but just accessible in terms of like, here is your database of decisions that were made, and you can find something that you can compare yourself to.
I think that there's a couple of interesting points within that, Andreas. You know, the first is, you mentioned a 510K summary or the authorization for a high-risk class 3 device in the United States. You can get in and see the evidence submitted and evidence accepted by the regulator. When we think of the middle risk devices, that's important because a lot of things under 510K, you claim substantial equivalence. You often don't have any of your own clinical evidence. But it comes down to the nature of that demonstration of substantial equivalence and your preclinical testing. So to help with the middle risk devices, I think there's a lot of good that we could do by, you know, validating appropriate non-clinical methods. And there's a world of researchers working on this, you know, from in-silico things to other ways of evaluating devices. So I think that's one thing where transparency is important, because if you're introducing a product in the US, you can search and see, has there been something authorized or cleared and the basis on which it was done? And you can essentially do the same thing then if you're a quite similar product. In Europe, when you try to do that, it's much more difficult. The reason for that is that we have some rules for transparency. So the high-risk devices, you know, the class 3s or certain class 2B products that administer or remove medicines, they can have a summary of safety and clinical performance, but there's the UDEMED database where they're supposed to be hosted is not functioning completely for that yet. I know that they're doing some work in the background, but I had a master's student look at this last year, and we were only able to find about 80 of those summaries available by, you know, going to companies and asking directly or looking on UDEMED. So we have transparency written into the law, but it's very difficult to access. So that makes it quite difficult to do a similar thing to Europe to what you could do in the United States. Um, so, if we think of the medicines world then and compare that to devices, you get a full European public assessment report. And within that, you can actually see often quite detailed findings that the regulator accepted this trial data but didn't like this data because of this methodological reason. And that gives you an even greater richness of knowledge about where are the watermarks of regulators. And if we want to really empower, translational developers thinking of clinical evidence in Europe, you have to be able to show them how similar things have gotten through the system. So over the last year, I was trying to promote the idea that we should make the clinical evaluation report publicly available for two reasons, really. I guess the first is a principled reason in that every research participant has put their hand up and enrolled in a study, maybe for their own good, but for the betterment of others. So when that's the principle that generates all of the evidence within your clinical evaluation report, it should be something that should be shared or shareable. But the other thing is that it's a real boost for new product developers because they can see where the watermarks lie. And it would also help regulators then to see if watermarks are wildly different in one place to another or for one technology compared to another. But we didn't win that battle. So the clinical evaluation report will not be public. And with the revision proposals to the medical device regulation, we'll have less of those public summaries, the SSCPs. The ones for patients are proposed to be removed entirely, and summaries of safety and clinical performance for things that meet the new definition of well-established technologies won't need a public summary. So we'll have less publicly available information in the future. But I think that kind of information is really important to product developers. And when I talk to new product developers, it's one of the first things they do is check the 510K clearance or check the US FDA data sources, because that helps them a lot in setting overall boundaries.
Exactly. Yeah, it's one of the first steps. You go ahead and see what has someone done that I could use as inspirations or as guidance to gain certainty.
Yeah.
Because at the beginning, you just don't know. I mean, sure, I think it's clear enough, vast majority of cases, on where you categorize yourself in terms of a risk level. That already gives you an indication of how much needs to be done. And then you start looking at other devices in that space.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah. Maybe one other point on that. When you go to the US and you read their summary of safety and effectiveness data for a high-risk device, it's laid out very clearly.
Right.
So someone who's new to regulation can read it and still get a sense of the preclinical evidence, the clinical study data.
Right.
When we looked at those summaries with the master's student, what we found is that because of the way that summaries of safety and clinical performance are set up in Europe, you can only extract it directly out of the clinical evaluation, which means that we're trying to provide transparency, but in the language of regulatory affairs. And that's a very difficult thing for your average clinician, or certainly for your patient, to understand. It's just framed quite differently.
Right.
And it can lead to documents that can be as short as 2 pages or as long as 200 pages, where you might find that a summary for a coronary stent will have maybe 20 pages dedicated to telling you about what atherosclerosis is. That's not what you need. What you need is just, here's the preclinical, here's the clinical evidence, and that's it. So I think, as well as access to these documents, we have some important work to do, I think, yet, to make sure that what is provided is readable and understandable to a clinician or to a patient. And I don't think we're quite there yet. So hopefully it's something that could be improved in the future.
Let's maybe move one step earlier still in the journey, and let's talk a little bit more about evidence. We touched upon the topic earlier, and then we jumped into, let's say, how we even can get guidance and even understand the framework under which we should gather it. And I think this is one of the key elements also, where we see a huge difference between drugs and devices. When you start the development for a drug, let's say generics aside, or biosimilars, where maybe bridging studies are good enough, there is a clear expectation. You go in and you basically have 2, but mostly 3 studies before you can put your product on the market, and it's quite clear what purpose each of the stages serve.
Yeah.
It's very different for devices, and you also said it. Well, we find very limited evidence of randomized controlled trials, which is the highest level of evidence that you can generate from a, let's say, scientific point of view on the device side. One of the things is that sort of like sometimes make it difficult is also that these are devices. So what do you really like? What's the best comparator for you to identify? This seems a bit easier with drugs. One, you have in a lot of cases an opportunity to simply say we use a placebo. And so what's your take from a regulatory perspective on an ideal scenario? And just to frame it, we're talking high-risk devices. We are not talking randomized controlled trials for stethoscope. I'm sure we are both in agreement that that's not necessary and this is not what we're talking about. But we're talking really high-risk devices that can have a high impact where we don't really have the standards. How do you see the approach to evidence generation in the concept of medical devices? And I think we should touch upon the topic of what do you think about sham devices and non-functional or no treatment groups? How would you suggest to medical device manufacturers out there to start thinking about the level of evidence that they can employ, not from a scientific view, not necessarily from a logistics view, because always faster and less complicated, the better. But if you wanted to generate good evidence, sometimes there is real logistical or ethical hurdles. What would you lead into the field for that consideration?
Yeah, I think for practical purposes, this often comes down to the individual developer and where they see their product being first sold or perhaps first reimbursed. And that then makes them work backwards to say, how do we hit these targets appropriately? Often to get your CE mark, you're typically dealing with an observational study. Sometimes you have an experimental study with a control group, but it's typically an observational study. There are other types of, ways you could set up your studies. You could perhaps do a non-inferiority study. And when you look at these things purely methodologically, the appropriate methods are often quite clear. So, if you're introducing a technology to an already busy field, you want to be demonstrating non-inferiority, but with some additional benefit, like a faster surgery or faster recovery time or something like that. Or otherwise, you look for superiority. But these are kind of ways of doing comparative studies. When you have just an observational study and you just want to get your CE mark, methods can be quite variable in my experience. So, if you just want to get your CE mark, that's usually the kind of route you go. But we have to remember, as you say, safety and efficacy in the medicines world is very different to safety and performance or sufficient clinical data in our world. But then when you go towards reimbursement, the standard is relative clinical effectiveness, which is, you're jumping, it's much stronger than efficacy even because you have to show that it is safe and has efficacy in a real world population. So there's an evidence chasm. So we have to figure out a better way to firstly avoid research waste by doing observational studies and then having to do another study for a reimbursement purpose or something like that. And we have to figure out when does it matter most for the high-risk devices to have, a minimal set of clinical design requirements, that you should have an experimental study in some scenarios, if it's a new or first in class or something like that. I think that in our system, we're kind of in middle ground in that there are guidance documents now and further, legislative change coming for things like breakthrough devices, where if you read the guidance that was produced at the end of last year, or look at the, proposals in the law now, it implies that, for these certain devices, you can have less than the average, but we don't quite know what the average is. So it's quite difficult to try and figure out what is the appropriate study design for a breakthrough technology, where there might be significant unmet need and limited alternatives, but still a quite high risk and unproven technology. There's a tension there between wanting to have the early access to a promising technology versus having the clinical surety that it will actually do them some good. So these are essentially policy questions where we could all have personal opinions, but it's going to be policy, I think, that will drive us. But the methods that we're going to apply, I think we have a lot of work to do to figure that out. And like our previous topic, I think transparency is a huge part to play in trying to help bring that sense of shape or consistency to it. If we don't know what's being accepted in the system as strategies, how are we going to further grow and develop?
Right.
So I think it is a real challenge, and there's a risk that it could be a persistent challenge for the years to come. Yeah, so I probably haven't answered your answer about what is the design that you should have. But it's essentially because the system is subjective, it's up to you. Yeah, you have the freedom to select it, but that comes with the tyranny of uncertainty that it will actually work or answer the questions you want to answer. And when we think about those studies with comparators and sham interventions, this will be done perhaps for things like renal denervation, let's say, where you might want to have your intervention group where you apply energy through your renal denervation device, and it may be a control group where you might puncture the leg but not apply the energy. These do raise legitimate ethical challenges because I guess I have some experience. I sit on the National Research Ethics Committee for Medical Device in Ireland, so I get to see studies that pass through, and there occasionally are studies with sham controls in them. I think when you're looking at those study designs, you're interested in first the potential patient going into the study. So they might have a 50-50 or some chance of intervention or sham control. So it's making sure they're aware of that. And then secondly, if you end up in the sham group, it's about ensuring that the kind of intervention that you need to do to blind it to the investigator or the person who'll see them after the intervention, you need to sufficiently blind it, but you have to think very carefully about doing something like an invasive procedure just to fulfill a sham requirement. So it is quite difficult. But I think sometimes when there is no other way to answer that question, we do sometimes have to apply some degree of risk to the sham group. But the patient, the prospective research participant, has to be fully informed of that. And it should often be in a scenario where there is no other way that you could generate this necessary knowledge to help help with the question that you have. Yeah. So it's essentially an ethical question, and the difference between being a regulator and thinking about ethics for these devices. When you're a regulator, you're worried about its conformance with the law. And when you're working in an ethics committee, you're interested in the value of that research and what are the obligations or the risks that a prospective patient might have. So it's kind of just two different ways of thinking about it. And, with ethics, when I started working at the ethics committee, I thought a bit like a regulator. I thought we'll be citing bits of the Declaration of Helsinki and, looking at rules. But really, it's more about values. So you don't have to know the Declaration of Helsinki off by heart. You have to just think about the consequences for the patient with that kind of mentality. This might be very valuable research, but is what we're asking of a patient a bit too much here, or is it okay, or is there a better way you could do it? So it's just a different kind of perspective you have to take.
Right. And then especially, I think when we're talking about sham devices and why, even if you're a well-intended manufacturer, and you're not saying we are driven primarily by speed to market, which there always will be pressure for that. It's clearly acknowledged, I guess. At the end of the day, if you're saying that from my own perspective, sort of like, I don't know, it's a well-researched group. We know what happens if you don't treat the patients, or can we have like a no treatment group versus our group? Is it really necessary to move with a sham device? And we've had studies ourselves where it was sort of like, I don't know, it's as you said, sort of like if you need to puncture the patients or something, that in and of itself can instill wound healing activities, cell regeneration, and that has an impact. We had this in urinary incontinence studies where sort of damage to the tissue could incite some level of regeneration, which might have an impact on outcome data. And then you're like, it's difficult. We need to go to a sham, so let's say a treatment without the active device group, because it's at least the procedure needs to be conducted because the procedure might have an impact. Thinking about that and thinking about that in the perspective of the claims that you are making is of course great. Sometimes when the discussions are around very positive, like safety profiles that you observe, where really the impact, because medical devices have a physical impact, not a pharmacological one. So if the impact on the patient of the procedure and the general safety risk to the patient is relatively low, even if it's invasive or classified because of, let's say, intermittent stay in the body for 28 plus days, but maybe not fully long-term, multiple years, already you are, in a higher risk class. So if all of those considerations mean you need more evidence, but at that point you're looking at, I have no expectations of side effects, then I think it becomes hard as a manufacturer to not want to optimize away gathering comparator data, because you can just say no control, I have data from literature or wherever.
Yeah.
Why do I need to subject half of my potential treatment group to an ineffective treatment when I do not get that additional information over the control group? I think here, due to the nature of medical devices, the focus on performance and the ability, as you said, to more subjectively discuss what's the body of evidence that we need, it's natural that we will have a tendency of wanting to, one, move fast, but also, if there's an opportunity, really argue for it or try to argue for it, to seek out an opportunity to present lower evidence. And even in a general conversation, I can say we would always recommend push above the edge. Suggest less than you think you may need, because if you don't get pushback, you promise too much already from the get-go. Like, for manufacturers, that's not a good strategy. The strategy should be find something that regulators don't agree to, because it means you have hit the edge. And that's the fine line that you should write. So I'm not sure if this is annoying if you're a regulator to understand that that's the perspective of the person on the other side. But I don't think it's naturally meant in a way to minimize evidence.
Yeah, no, I guess when I finished work as a regulator and then went to academia and started supporting some very early stage startups or product developers, you start to understand in a much more, I guess, vivid way, things like the challenge of a time delay. So,
Yes.
a time delay of 3 months to a regulator would be like, well, some things take us 2 years, 3 months is nothing. But for a company where your overhead costs, you might be spending 50 or 100,000 a month, and it takes you another 3 months. That's just an enormous challenge for the company. And for the really early stage guys with early stage funding, it can be a survival type challenge.
Exactly.
If things take too long. So I think that there are certainly prerogatives, especially with the startup world, where they simply have to work within their funding envelope. They have to answer to a board who will say, oh, you say it takes 6 months, why can you do it in 3? So these kind of pragmatic things certainly percolate their way down. I don't know the extent to which regulators get frustrated or not. I think one of the things that, I realized after finishing work as a regulator is that we spend very little time focused on methods of study design when you're looking at a medical device study. We got to engage with regulators last year and we reported on it in a paper in January, but we got to put the regulatory system up on the examination table and have a look at it. And it was really interesting. We did a workshop. Again, there was quite a few authorities attended, but their clear message in terms of their responsibility, their job is to see, is this product a fit one to be placed in a human? So their focus is often on determining, was the extent of preclinical testing enough to justify that there's no more useful knowledge that you need to gather. You can now justify exposing it to humans. So that's kind of the way they see it. So it's much more a product protection than a methods question. And like we were saying earlier, that means that you'll have applied methods, generated evidence, and then it's assessed by a notified body. So methods find themselves in something of a blind spot in the system. But, I did get a deeper understanding in the last years in academia, seeing startups about the pressures that they have to survive and to implement things under the funding envelope they have. So yeah, I'm not sure, does it cause frustration? I'm not sure if there's an enormous focus on methods amongst regulators when thinking of a study. They really want to make sure that you've tested it enough to justify its exposure. But I think, to help with that whole process, because setting up a study and having to run it for 3 or 6 or 12 months or whatever, these are huge investments, and they're often pivotal to the company's development. In my simple way of looking at new product developers, and I interact with them as an academic, so I haven't done it myself, but what I see across all of them is that there's kind of 4 key strategies you need to translate. You need your clinical strategy, your regulatory strategy, your technology strategy, and your business strategy. Um, and if you map those out, there's a nice framework called Gates. They have some tools for kind of project management for these things. And if you look at examples, it's not a linear, we've all this done now and we go to the next bit. Often you find you'll get your prototype, your first version of your prototype, test it, and you have to go back and redesign it. So there's a lot of things, or you might do your first animal study, no good, back, redesign, next animal study. So it's not a linear process, even though you have these strategies. So I think this is the thing that in our European regulatory system, these can all be incorporated. But I think that we still have work to do to just try and make it clearer for people, especially in the clinical domain. What are the minimally acceptable standards? You can always go above it, but you shouldn't go too far below it. But we don't have a home for these kind of things. That's not really an ISO standard, or we haven't done that kind of thing through MDCG documents. And you could do it through those common specifications, but to justify writing one of them, you have to have an absent or insufficient standard or an identified public health concern. So we haven't really got a forum yet that can make a decision that those criteria are met to write a common specification. So it's something where we have to make this clearer, because in my experience now, when I sit down with a new product developer, and it might be a hardware device or an AI-enabled one, we talk through the pathway in Europe and the pathway in the US. And what I hear every time is, oh, we'll go with US then, simply because it's clearer. And for the bits that aren't clear, you can get an answer. That is the vital thing that we have to try and address in Europe, I think, to really support innovation.
You mentioned observational data a little bit, and in terms of sort of like study designs when we talked about evidence. So one of the things that I think, since you brought up AI, before everyone, the only thing anyone ever talked about was AI. A lot of talk was around real-world data, real-world evidence, and so on, which is also more of the observational nature, or exclusively of the observational nature. So can you tell us a little bit about where real-world data, first of all, can you define it for us, how you as a regulator see real-world data, real-world evidence, and what you think is its most appropriate use in the clinical evidence flow, which again is a broad answer to give for a spectrum of devices that we have, but I would love to hear your perspective.
Well, there's a formal definition, not within our regulation or EU guidance, but the International Medical Device Regulators Forum would have a definition. So in general, real-world data is that which is collected routinely through electronic health records or defined registries. So it's a means of passively collecting data, and then it gives you an opportunity to go and analyze it later. Now, for medical devices, this has greatest relevance for post-market monitoring, because if you think of the orthopedic world, you could do a clinical study and you could run that to 6 months or a year, and you might enroll 300 or 500 patients. But if you put that same device with a CE mark into a high-quality registry, you can have thousands of outcomes, and they're collected, every 3 months, and it's updated, and you get an annual report. And it allows you to see the granularity of, let's say you have 2 parts of a knee replacement implant. Sometimes you might use 2 different products, or the different combinations can be used in orthopedics. And it can allow you to see if there is any camouflaged poor product performers from these combinations. So it might be the overall knee is okay, but if you use it in this way or in this population, you'll have an outlier. It allows you to see that very quickly on very good quality data. So for post-market monitoring, it's really excellent. I think there's great opportunity beyond post-market monitoring. When you have very good registries, you can actually embed a trial in a registry. and run it to a standard almost as good as GCP.
Mm-hmm.
There are a few examples like that, but not very many. But when we think of the cost involved in running a pre-market clinical study versus the cost for registry, you could generate high quality data for a fraction of the cost. But that's not quite empowered yet. Now, what are the barriers to real world data for medical devices in Europe? I think the first thing is that, again, comparing to medicines, I'm doing that a lot today, but for medicines, you can have a mandatory post-authorization safety study or a voluntary one.
Right.
And these have the, defined rules and clear approaches, and defined data sources, the Darwin network, and the various, something like 180 hospital electronic health record networks it can link to. So that allows, let's say during COVID, we had some vaccines that had a possible signal for venous sinus thrombosis. So you could run a real world study and actually examine that safety signal very quickly using electronic health record data if it's of sufficient quality. But in device land, there's no one who asks as a regulator for a post-market study. The US can do it. They call it a 522 study. So no one asks for them. So it's really only if the manufacturer wants to or the notified body encourages them to. So it's an area that may grow organically, but could grow a lot faster and better if we had a greater push from the regulatory side to define when should a study be required, when should a notified body set it as a condition. This is something that's talked about a lot these days, because with the changes to the legislation, notified bodies will not be able to reassess a device, within 5 years. That's going to be deleted as a general rule. That's likely to incentivize the notified bodies to start asking for post-market evidence and setting conditions on certificates. But if we let 55 notified bodies do this in their own way, we'll have many, many different approaches. So I think to harness the true benefit that you can get from analyzing real-world data, we need to set some simple parameters for the regulatory system to say when you ask for it and why, to try and make that more consistent. And we need to do a lot more work then on the quality of the data. A couple of things I would say there, firstly, when you look to the registry world, lots of registries were started by clinicians or clinical communities as a result of a safety problem. So they really grew after metal on metal with orthopedic implants, and grew in cardiology for lots of different reasons. But in many of these registries, it might just say that you've had an implantable aortic valve. It might not say product X from manufacturer Y or version whatever. And some do. So we have a lot of work to do to understand what is the granularity of device information within these registries. And then we have to figure out how to help those who might use that real world data. So there's a huge amount of work needed to figure out the feasibility of doing a real world study, either with registry data or electronic health record data, where you have to go in and see, are these coded in this way? Were they populated in a way we'd have confidence in? So that feasibility check is one where I think it's valued a lot more in the medicine side for real world data. They put effort into looking at the feasibility of running a real world study. And we have nothing to do something like that for medical devices in Europe. So unless we actually help manufacturers or developers to understand the watermarks for assessing feasibility, they're not going to be as confident to go and actually pay to access and then analyze that data. So there's a number of quite fundamental things we have to do to empower real world data in Europe, to try and catch up with our medicines friends.
Yeah, that's probably very true. I think from our perspective, a lot of the work that happens in the post-market space, which there is probably minimally interventional studies.
Yeah.
And their primary focus is marketing driven. And I think this is one of the differences between drugs and devices as well. For a device, the customer is a doctor in a lot of cases, because it's sort of like an end user and need to be happy with it. And if you get it into their hands, they are more natural to use it, prescribe it, or whatnot. And so in the post-market space, having, let's say, real-world evidence-like studies where you basically follow the patient through, but a limited number, and then you go to sites that are not using your device yet, you can use it simultaneously for marketing purpose. So this is something that we see a bit more of. Um, and it allows for the data standardization that you also sort of like called for a bit more, because it's sort of like structural data assessment. It is not really strongly regulated. The use of the device is already reimbursed because it's on the market. If the device is reimbursed, that makes everything a little bit easier for the manufacturer to do. So it sort of incentivizes a little bit data collection at a slightly larger scale under more real world conditions, not really stringently, like not really heavily restricted.
Yep.
And it can already give you a lot of indications of what preclinical data, because of the pressure of time, money, investment, and pull to market, cannot really give you. It's probably a little bit too distinct from the level of real world evidence that you had, and it's again very sort of like pointed. It's you take, if you sell 100,000 of your units of your product, and then you say, well, let's assess 100 of them or 200 or 300 of them in a very specific study with people that haven't used it before. That's your population. Wide scale assessment of data in a more general European data space. We have those European level pushes, at least for regulators to have more access to that data. Whether manufacturers will have the same, we will have to see. Could enable definitely more knowledge for devices. Would you say, if this is a reality that we are going to reach, that it's more systematic, we have more structured follow-up eventually? I'm sure it's going to take a little bit of more time, but eventually we have simply a more interconnected health space. We know more about the devices naturally. Would you say that that could also be an incentive for regulators to say, we gain so much insight so quickly, we are fine with having that as a, let's say, post-market committal, because any sort of like signal detection would be very easy for us. So we can lower the burden of pre-market evidence if we come to that space, or...
Yeah. Well, I think that that is a desire that regulators or policymakers would have, that we allow devices come to market with some uncertainty, but that's okay in the regulatory world if we have a reasonably good way of monitoring it in the post-market. So you see this in the breakthrough guidance, the orphan device guidance. It is mentioned there. I think it would be really great for the system if we were able to better implement that. And in addition to the kinds of challenges we talked about earlier, I think one of the challenges in our regulatory system is that we think in terms of the legal wording and apply that as a procedure. We're not yet thinking about the methods, the data, or the evidence, and to best utilize the potential of things like the European health data space and registries, and better utilizing things coming from electronic health records, as well as connected devices and all of these things. There's enormous potential, but if we just look at it in terms of, so are you calling that proactive post-market surveillance, or a post-market clinical follow-up activity, or a post-market clinical follow-up investigation? That's a very surface level way of looking at it. So I think we have to find a way to get more into the methods, data, and evidence. But it's currently underappreciated, I think, in the system now. So, when we think of how did we get towards the Darwin network and the, real world data or big data that is possible for medical devices, we have to start forming interest groups linked to regulators that can actually help them with that. There are some promising research projects. I was involved in one innovative health initiative project. So it's a public-private partnership called GREG. GREG is Guidelines for Real-World Evidence Generation. It's a very interesting project because it brings both medicines and device people together. So there's really nice cross-learning that can happen in that kind of place. But I think one of the nice things about that project is that it's looking to develop use cases and then share experience based on those use cases, where we can go in and think about feasibility of a device study, sort of how they would think of feasibility of a medicine study, and then think of, what is the best way to consider the methods then. Now, there's a lot more information in the medicines world, you can see that, well, in this medicines authorization, they liked that, but didn't like the external comparator arm for some reason.
Yeah.
You can find things out from the regulators' reasoning. We don't have that in Europe.
Right.
So we're going to have to get people around the table and start talking this out. But I think if the focus shifts more towards methods and away from the procedures, because that's a very superficial level way of thinking of it, that would really help empower us. And with all of these kind of technical terms, if you think in a very simple way, pregnant women have cardiotocography done. It's like an ECG of their tummy. Right now, those machines capture great data, but sometimes they're coded in slightly different ways, and there's lots of different providers. If we had something simple like a simple way of coding the same data and a way to pool it, you would be able to, with just a few little bits of data from electronic health records, start to look for possible early signals of fetal deterioration. So there's enormous potential in these things, but that can only come true if we start actually thinking of the data rather than the procedure that is applied to a company. So we've just yet to get to that next level. So hopefully it will come at some stage. Yeah.
I feel we're lacking behind a little bit there, especially internationally speaking. And even the US, if you just look at registrational data, they have already structured the drug side quite well. Even there, the device side is not as far. We see this standards to make it very accessible for them to really assess what level of data you have. This is one step further. If you go to 10 different hospitals, for example, in Germany, you will find 10 different ways that data is coded in their e-health records. And sure, then everyone says like, well, we have a level of fire standard for how the health data could potentially be accessed, but it's still a big struggle. And we are not sort of like mandating strongly enough one system. I have friends working in IT in hospitals, in university clinics, and they also say like, yeah, the first thing that they say is let's develop our own standard, and that's of course exactly wrong thing. And I know that we have, I guess, a tendency to, on the one hand, think that we are sometimes over-regulating here in Europe. And it's complicated to define a standard as widely applicable. We have noticed this in our entire discussion today with medical device in of itself. The diversity is there, and the diversity is there in the health data space. But somehow we need to put it together, and you need to start at a certain point. And if we have something established, let's build upon it and move from there. We have great European initiatives, so they have already started structuring large sets of data, diverse data. A good approach would be to simply say, we're just going to say we are using this as standard now, and we stop the conversations. Sometimes I feel this is a more appropriate reaction to meaningfully move forward rather than continuing conversation for 10 years and still not having achieved anything.
Yeah. I think sometimes it is better to move forward with the inelegant and not perfect solution because it's better than doing nothing. Absolutely. When we think internationally about, real world data, I think we do have certain strengths in Europe. For certain clinical areas, like orthopedics, for example, my colleagues who work in orthopedics and are involved in registries will tell us that, if you look at the Dutch arthroplasty registry, that would have over 98% completeness. Whereas, for equivalent to orthopedic registries in the United States, it may be 60% completeness. So we do have lots of really high quality data sources. I don't think it's the quality of the data that's the challenge, but it's applicability or the incentives in the regulatory system. That seems to be where it's just unclear. And for a company, that just means, well, why would I invest in analyzing or accessing that data when I don't really know if I need it? The regulatory side has more work to do there. And on, different data standards, it's outside of my scope of competence, but from having worked with some methodologists, in research projects, they can do really excellent work on trying to standardize different data sources. They OMAP the data, or you try to apply a common data model. That's a huge amount of work in practice, but it can allow you to compare disparately coded electronic health record data. So it is possible, but you're right. It would be much nicer if we all had the one standard, but not the
Exactly.
world we find. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, very true. All right, let's maybe move to, you briefly mentioned already here and there, breakthrough devices, orphan diseases. I know it's a really special topic, and it's one that, since we're on the topic of regulations and the impact and how can we sort of like stay innovative, what type of evidence do we need, it all ties together. And it significantly, all of the topics we discussed today, and disproportionately impacts orphan devices and also pediatric devices.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, uh, the level of evidence needed can sometimes be even or it comes, the level of evidence required, if it stays the same for these types of devices, is so much harder to gather, because there's few of those patients. It's harder to gather that information overall. And the return on invest is harder to argue for,
Yeah.
because there are fewer patients that will use the device or will benefit from its use. So what we have seen, and there was a lot of, again, probably industry driven, but general outcry over loss of legacy devices as we moved from medical device directive to medical device regulation, because a lot of devices that had been on the market, sometimes in off-label use, but sometimes also just on the market with less evidence under medical device directive, were reclassified or had to meet requirements of higher evidence requirements.
Yeah.
So a lot of conversations around lack, especially of orphan devices or pediatric devices, where there is simply no business case to keep them on the market. With the end of the transition period, that means that a bunch of devices were sort of like pulled off the market. It depends, like some could stay on stock and so on. And that's just a retrospective view. Now looking into the future, there are still rare diseases that would strongly benefit from available medical devices. There are a lot of pediatric diseases that, or let's say, pediatric associated indications that would really benefit from devices. But we don't really, at least not to my feeling, have a very strong incentive structure for those economically less favorable indications to provide devices, and also meaningful but sufficient evidence. What's your take on balancing, especially for these rare indications, for pediatric indications, vulnerable populations, evidence versus risk versus unfavorable market condition, but the unmet need that we find because of exactly that? How do we solve that conundrum?
Yeah. No, I think you lay it out perfectly. We we had certainly quite some problems over the last years when we saw the MDR being implemented and this phenomena of disappearing devices. I was working as a regulator and chairing the clinical working group back in October of 2021, when a number of cardiology practitioners came to us via the European Society of Cardiology, and they said, we've seen about 20 products, clips, coils, stents of certain sizes that we use that the companies have told us are disappearing. And I still remember the call because I had this sinking realization that, oh my, this might be a problem this might be the crest of a wave we're getting hit with. And there's very little things you could do as a regulator to turn that tide around. And as you describe it, the challenges were that, for general medical device manufacturers, they trim their portfolios. So they
Right.
know internally if something is running into marginal or potentially loss-making territory, it's out. What that meant for the clinical community is that, we used to have 3 different Rashkin balloons available in Europe, before 2021. 2 of them were withdrawn from the market, and there was 1 remaining, and then they couldn't get through their CE certification. So this left us in Europe with no Rashkin balloons. And a Rashkin balloon is something that is used for newborn babies when they have congenital heart disease and you need to open the atria in their heart. If you cannot get into the neonatal ICU and put this in under ultrasound guidance, you have to bring that child sometimes in the middle of the night for emergency surgery. which is, my colleagues in pediatric cardiology would say you have the B team on. No disrespect to the night surgeons, but so it's not necessarily the team lead who's going to be in doing that emergency surgery. And this was all because of products becoming unavailable all of a sudden. So this was a very real problem, which did result in a guidance document and now some legislative proposals to change the medical device regulation. When you talk about the incentives, it's very different to the medicines world, where there can be exclusivity periods or things that are valuable to companies offered when you engage in pediatric investigation plans and proceed with marketing and that kind of thing. In the device world, we don't have a carrot in a similar way. So what the guidance and the proposed changes to the law would say is that you could become designated as an orphan device. So we have a definition now. We transplanted it in some sense from the US, so it has to be a device not expected to be used for more than 12,000 patients a year in the EU, where there's a lack of alternatives and an expected clinical benefit. So if you get designated as an orphan device, then that can open out two new things with the revision proposal. You get a 50% fee reduction, and you also get advice and support. When we looked at those Rashkin balloons, we wrote a paper on it and tried to explain to regulators what we think needs to be done, because clinicians were not happy, because it just meant the care for their patients was disrupted. But when we looked at the cost, we found that the cost in Europe for your initial CE mark was something like 130,000, I think, for this company and this product. When you looked at the equivalent cost in the United States, it went through the 510K process, so a light touch process, but with a small business fee, it's something like 5,000 or 3,000 euro or something like that. So it was a huge difference, and you could see why companies would say, well, we're deprioritizing the EU market now as a result. So I think the 50% fee reduction will be a help. It probably won't resolve things because we still may be more expensive in some cases. One of the other changes that's proposed is an interesting one. You mentioned the transition timeline as well. They're proposing now that if you're designated as an orphan device, you could have grandfathering. So if you're a legacy, so CE marked under the directive, and an orphan device, you're grandfathered into the new system. And I think it's very interesting that grandfathering is only being applied to orphan devices. We could have had a much clearer path over the last years if we had figured out an approach for grandfathering in a more widespread way. This is something that has been done in different ways as legislation has improved when I think of the US experience. So when they went from the requirements for a medicine just to show safety, but not safety and efficacy, that led us to thalidomide. And after thalidomide, we said medicines need safety and efficacy. But this landed as a requirement to the FDA, where they were already busy with their day-to-day casework, and suddenly they had to go back and do a retrospective review of something like 5,000 medicines approved from 1938 to 1962 to see, does that work? So nothing happened under the FDA commissioner that was there when the amendments were passed in 1962. But a new FDA commissioner called James Goddard came into post, and he made it his first priority. And he just reached out to the academies again and got a bunch of scientists and formed a variety of committees. And they actually got that retrospective review of nearly 5,000 medicines done quite quickly. That's how you appropriately tidy up a sector when you want to improve an evidence standard. With medical devices, they had grandfathering. They couldn't go back. They didn't even have an inventory of all devices. By 1976, they had an idea, but not a full list. So they needed to use grandfathering. And with the medical device regulation in Europe, we didn't do a retrospective review or grandfathering. We just kind of baked new requirements into the cake and expected everyone to comply. So I think that just volume of new requirements being applied where no one was quite sure, do I need to repeat testing or do something new? And we're not sure. And maybe we just need to do something more in the post-market. But I think all of that evidence uncertainty was one of the main drivers that led companies to just go, well, we're not going to invest in that quite uncertain pathway anymore for this type of product. And it was pediatrics and rare diseases that we're at the particularly blunt end because, like you say, the market dynamics and the number of alternative devices, but also, as you mentioned, in fields like pediatric cardiology, nearly 2/3 of the devices are adult devices used for children.
Right.
Pediatric cardiology would not survive without off-label use.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's been a quite challenging topic, and one of the things that I've been thinking about more recently, with the changes to the MDR, we'll have orphan devices and breakthrough devices,
Mm-hmm.
but there still remain a lot of devices that would fall over the orphan threshold of 12,000 that still need to be protected. So examples of this would be things like accessories for dialysis for children. That'll go over the threshold, but it's still a quite niche area with vulnerable market dynamics. So what we have suggested to policymakers through Biomed Alliance, which is a group of clinical associations, is that they include a third definition of pediatric devices. And we find a way to designate and protect them even if they fall over the orphan threshold. So we've proposed it and we'll see what will happen, but something like that I think would help protect other vulnerable products for the future years.
And do you generally see a concern with off-label use, especially for these groups? Because at the end of the day, it feels unintentional. It sort of feels like you're moving requirements away from the manufacturer and say, it's not our problem, we'll not deal with it, we will outsource that to another party. One of the other fields, and we'll come to speak to it, I'm sure soon in sort of like the next section, we see that also with artificial intelligence, new algorithm developed, not for clinical use. End user can decide if they want to use it or not. It's up to them. So it feels very unintentional. And at the end of the day, it sort of caters to the idea that as a doctor, you have the best interest for your patients. And so you're willing to take that risk upon yourself for your patients. But that's not the intention of the system. So what's your perspective on off-label use, which definitely has its place, but as a replacement for better means of developing safe products for the market?
Yeah. The way the medical device regulation is set up now, it just has a tiny bit of wording on off-label use. It's in the annex on post-market monitoring, and it says that manufacturers shall monitor for systematic off-label use and analyze the device to verify the intended purpose is correct. So somewhat vague. You're right to say that when a product is used off-label, it's the responsibility that shifts to the clinician. So if something goes wrong, the manufacturer can say, well, we didn't market it for that, so it falls under professional liability, which is a challenge for those clinicians if there's a legal case or a poor outcome. I think that it's essential that we protect necessary off-label use. So it's simply just how whole fields would stop if you were to prohibit it. And it does draw out an interesting tension because regulators or product regulators, they have no role in the practice of medicine. And FDA say that clearly, we are not responsible for the practice of medicine. And then that opens out interesting questions around, what's sometimes called in the US, the right to try, or, people who have well-meaning and a potential technology, but one that isn't approved in the appropriate regulatory way. So when there is no alternative, and the off-label use of a device is in the best interest of the patient, I think there's a duty to have that informed consent discussion with the patient or family. In the UK is one of the few regulatory bodies that has a policy on off-label use, and they would say that that should be documented in the clinical chart, which is a nice idea. But
it's a step.
Yeah, but it's very much within the practice of medicine.
Right.
But I think that regulators have a responsibility that if there is a device, regardless of its label, but if it's essential, it needs to be protected. So what are the tools you can use? If something is going to disappear and if regulators can find out early enough, you can issue a derogation. So let's say the product is essential, but it's going to lose its CE mark. Regulators can step in place of notified bodies and give a derogation. This is how Rashkin balloons got into a number of countries when they were needed, but it's heavily bureaucratic currently. So every country has a different process. In Ireland, you have a manufacturer document and a clinician document for every single patient case. So companies can only support that for so long if there's many cases involved. So we need to have an appropriate way to give an EU-wide derogation, which is possible, but is underexploited. I think there's been one derogation so far, and there may be a second one in the next while. But I don't think it can be regulators alone who can make that decision. They need support from clinical communities to say, yeah, no, this is actually essential. If we don't get this, bad things will happen. We just need to figure out the appropriate way to have a forum where that can work. And we don't really have that yet. There is the Medical Devices Shortages Steering Group that was brought in post-COVID as part of the extended mandate of the EMA to have a group looking at that. And there is now a requirement on manufacturers to give 6 months notice in certain scenarios to regulators. What's the end effect of that to clinical practice? We don't know yet. So I think we need to be a bit more proactive about it. And if you do get that 6-month signal, and if it looks like it's a really important problem, get clinicians to advise if it's essential or not, that it should be protected and derogated. I think we have to make that work a little bit better in the system.
Right. It sounds like it's sort of fancy initiatives, and you can say that we have done something to address the problem because the problem is widely discussed, and you can say, well, but we have this group and we have this pathway and we have here, but at the end of the day, the practical implications are zero or close to zero. So so that doesn't make it any easier.
I'll bring you to Brussels.
Welcome to Brussels. So maybe let's switch to AI, because it's of course a very relevant topic, and it hugely impacts especially the medical device space. Within a matter of years, a lot has changed in terms of how we can, I guess, diagnose in various different ways. And this is from, let's say, making through medical devices more data of our bodies accessible to us. We can analyze that data better or more easily, let's say. We can help break down diagnostic processes for a layperson. We have made huge strides with image assessment and so on, and there is a, let's say, white space in which artificial intelligence engages with our health. A fraction of which is designated. It sometimes feels like a bad joke, and I don't know, like a large language model, a wellness product, and a medical device walk into a bar type situation. It feels exactly like that. How do you what's your take on how we should effectively, how are we and how should we differentiate the space around especially AI-enabled medical devices? What is a medical device in that space? Where should we draw a line? Where do we draw a line at the moment? And what needs to change for consumer protection, but at the same time also to ensure that there's continued opportunity for innovation within Europe, and we're not just left with a bunch of devices from China and US?
It's a lot in that question. Let's see. When we think of large language models in healthcare, I wrote a paper with Steve Gilbert from Dresden here in Germany. Very simple paper, but was published in Nature Medicine. Large language models require approval as medical devices when you use them medically. The way our regulatory system is set up, it's all predicated around the intended purpose of the manufacturer. Now, if you have something that, if you ask it, am I having a heart attack, it'll give you advice or something along those lines, that seems to be fulfilling a medical purpose, a diagnostic, predictive, whatever you'd like to call it under the definition of a medical device, but they're not appropriately regulated as such. And if you were to say, let's take ChatGPT and bring it through MDR, there's lots of challenges in seeking to validate a model that has a black box nature that is not capable of having the same output with the same input every time. So that leads often to discussions around guardrails and, real world validation. So large language models are one thing, but we have so many other uses of artificial
Mm.
intelligence, like you say, in imaging, that is now rolled out and implemented in hospitals in many cases. And I think, one of the basic points I would make is that if we think of technology and us, civilization, both of us change in a symbiotic way.
Mm.
So before clocks, people met and interacted in wildly different ways. Like, I'll see you tomorrow. Whereas now we've clocks, I can see you at, exactly 1 o'clock. So a similar change to what happened when clocks arrived will have to happen to how AI has now arrived into radiology suites and hospitals. Um, what it will mean is that it changes the way in which we can provide decisions or diagnosis for patients. It also changes the way in which radiologists will interact with their images, and people talk a lot about de-skilling if you become overly reliant upon the recommendation.
Yeah.
And there's lots of legal questions around, a lot of these algorithms will not give you a defined thing. It's just advice or a prediction, but it's still left to you to do further interpretation because there's lots of legal liability wording worked into that.
Mhm.
So I think we have to work across a variety of different communities, understand what's valuable, and understand what needs to change in how we think about the technologies. Um, so I think that, for things like mammography screening, where, let's say, in some countries, like in France, from what I understand, you need to have, I think, 3 radiologists signing off on every mammography to ensure quality. So an AI algorithm could go in and drive efficiency there if we have data of sufficient quality that's convincing to say, we just need 1 human and 1 algorithm, or 2 humans and 1 algorithm.
Mm.
Um, so there's a huge amount of, it just means we have to think about these things quite differently. And when we think in a regulatory sense about them, think of a mammography screening tool. You can build into some of these models an offender button. So if human and algorithm disagree, that should be flagged and that should go back to the company for an analysis, and
Mm.
someone should decide which is right, and was it the radiologist or the algorithm that has come
Mm.
to the different decision here. So we need to figure out, firstly, the clinical evidence is often quite poor. So there's a number of analyses that have been done. You can go through the list of, I think, nearly 1,400 AI devices on the US webpage, or try and find ones in Europe. But clinical validation in terms of a prospective study is quite rare. So a lot of these things are prepared on training data and some form of tuning data and rolled out. And in the regulatory world, how do you put what's your pathway for clinical evaluation for that? I think it's likely to be variable amongst notified bodies. Some will be happier to say clinical data in the classical sense is not deemed appropriate, so you can go via Article 6110 and no prospective clinical study. And maybe other notified bodies have different perspectives on that. But yeah, it's one where I think the basis of regulation is to ensure the product is safe for people using it. So again, just like with the implants, we have to get in and figure out what are those critical decisions or recommendations where we should have, rigorous prospective clinical evidence. So, that would be things like, if you have automatic hemorrhage detection for a CT scanner in the context of stroke. So, Viz.ai would be a company that's exemplary of that. There are scenarios where you really do need good quality evidence to justify implementing this safely. And for lots of other things, it's going to be much more case dependent. Sometimes you can get quite excellent data from things like imaging data banks. So if you're doing an imaging device and there's a data bank
Right.
and things are labeled and tagged effectively, you can get quite good evidence from it. And for those kind of examples or areas, we need to figure out, is that an appropriate validation for its context of use? But I think our challenge in Europe currently is that we're figuring out the overlevel architecture. So over the past year, there's been a huge amount of debates about, does the whole AI Act apply as well as the MDR or IVDR? And it was decided last year that, well, it should probably just be the MDR, but that is not how it's prepared in the AI Act. So there's been legislative changes, and they're looking to, bring, these high-risk devices regulated under other product legislation solely under that legislation. But part of the way that that will be implemented is that the MDR regulators will need to come up with guidance that will incorporate the important elements from the AI Act, so things like explainability or transparency, which are not really apparent in the medical device world in a whole-scale way. So I think we're starting to get clarity on the overall legal approach. So it'll be MDR with AI Act requirements within it. There's going to be some challenges based on the timelines because we'll have to designate notified bodies to do that kind of task, and that hasn't been figured out yet. Once we get these big, chunky things figured out, then I think it's really important that we figure out when good quality evidence is needed. But I don't think any regulator around the world has gotten a completely clear steer on that yet. And to make that better for everyone, I think we have more work to do on thinking about risk classification for especially AI medical devices. There is a proposal to change what's called Rule 11, which is the software classification rules. And they've been, challenging, especially here in Germany. There's different interpretations. Is it possible to have a class 1 software medical device, or does it always need to be class 2A or above? So we need to first better classify these, and once we figure that bit out, then figuring out the kinds of evidence generation based on a risk classification will be easier. But when you look across, the US or the UK, where things are uniformly class 1 because they have the old directive type rules, and then in Europe where we have Rule 11, things could come out with quite different classifications all over the place. So I think we have higher level challenges in the regulatory world to get the basic blocks in first, and hopefully then that would lead us to a better approach to clarifying evidence for devices. Yeah, there's a lot of implementation work yet to do.
Right. And specifically to AI, and let's say for the radiology example that you brought, we have seen AIs outperform doctors. It's very interesting that you mentioned the case in France, where you actually, to ensure quality, need 3 opinions. If we go to trials and how to generate the evidence, we would also say, let's say 2 people, maybe 3 as a third person as a tiebreaker, humans rate an image, and this we use as a gold standard for AI to compare to, because a single investigator is unlikely to be more accurate than an AI looking at an image. And for that reason, you can't even establish ground truth anymore. So in this space, I think we need to understand that even fundamentally for the care of our patients, it's advantageous to use these tools. So we need to make sure that, yes, we do provide ample evidence, but also ease of integration to allow them to get to the market, because for the day-to-day routine, especially given strain on healthcare budgets, extremely high workload, and therefore the ease of, let's say, cases going undetected or care not being provided well, it's good if we have these tools. So I think you pointed out very adequately that we say, yes, we need clear guidance and we need clear requirements for evidence and the direction that we should take, and it's urgent.
Yeah, and you touch on an interesting point in that, like we were saying earlier, these technologies will change the way we interact and think about things in some ways. One of the most challenging things in my experience is working on changes to health service delivery. That can be a real challenge, and it's quite different across different countries or member states. But when you're looking to implement a new digital health technology, getting your clinical validation is one thing, but understanding, well, could this actually work? Let's say you have a decentralized care at home model. We want to shift patients home and monitor them there, and we've got this great evidence that this can be done in a safe way. But it might actually be the change in organizational nature of that service within the hospital that can be the really hard part. So I think
and the risky.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So that's just another challenge that you get when you try to implement these digital health technologies. And as you were saying, Andreas, budgets are constrained, and hospitals might buy some AI technologies when they see clear need, clear benefit, and efficiency for them. But if you talk to radiologists, a lot of these AI algorithms are distinct and they have their own workflow. So you have to go into your pack, so your imaging system, and then into a workflow. And then if you've got 5 of these, you're into 5 different workflows, and it becomes a real pain. So there's lots of, possible refinements you could do just to make the user experience better as the number of AI tools could increase. Yes, there's lots of just practical things that would be helpful for better integration, but it is certainly changing medicine. Um, it's changing the way we think about decisions, and especially for patients, the most common person they consult or person resource they consult is Dr. Google or maybe Dr. Chatbot before an actual doctor.
Yes.
So this is a hugely different way in that patients think about their diagnosis or their condition or their symptoms. So yeah, it's just a huge change for all of us, as well as the regulators.
Yeah. That's true. It's very dynamic, and we have, just ventured into this space.
Yeah.
There's much to
Yeah, just getting started.
Mm.
Yeah.
So let's move into future and what to change, because I think a clear sort of like line through all of the topic that we touched upon is, and I think this is especially true for Europe, we've just sort of touched upon it, that in other countries a bit better, is the level of clarity of over requirements and how to get there, and the different stakeholders that we have involved. You have played on various different tables. You have been, you started out as a healthcare professional, applying, let's say, the outcome of what our innovation system applies. You moved over to the regulator side. You have discussed on a European level. You're a professor, and therefore teach, let's say, a new group of people to venture into this space and look out for how we can change the future of our own healthcare here in Europe. So you have a very broad perspective on the space. And now we are at a time where you mentioned it initially. Also, we're talking about MDR 2.0. We sort of like want to discuss some ways of changing our legislation. What's the core problem that should be addressed in the near future? How is it being addressed? So, what's the, let's say, what's your take on the status of this conversation, and what really needs to happen for a right balance to be struck between innovation, risk for patient, adequate level of evidence, and accessibility of healthcare products?
Yeah. Predicting the future is never easy. We cannot be sure, but we have some directions on where things are going with the revision to the legislation. What these changes to the medical device and IVD rules are proposed to support is competitiveness and innovation. So this is very clearly the mandate of what's called this simplification package for these 2 regulations. That runs into some tension from my clinical perspective when we have, to give one very simple example, if you want to market a new heart valve today, MDR says you need a clinical investigation. Doesn't say what kind, you need one. With these revisions, it won't need one, as long as there is something similar available to which you can claim equivalence to.
Right. That has been challenging with MDR, because you need access to primary data.
Yeah, so and regulators ended up describing different levels of access. So, Article 61.5 is the part that says you need a contract to claim equivalence when you're class 3.
Which is completely unrealistic to happen, except it's your own
Exactly,
product.
So it was an effective prohibition by the legislators for that equivalence route in all but very limited circumstances. And back in 2012, the European Commission said that, equivalence as a mean to avoid pre-market clinical studies for a high-risk device should not be allowed. So they were quite clear after the crises of metal-on-metal hip implants and the breast implant crisis that should be the approach. But it's now flipped 180. And to me, this is kind of demonstrative of a system where we're still reasonably well gripped by policy-based evidence rather than evidence-based policy. when a heart valve needs a clinical study today and a heart valve won't need one after these revisions, that's an enormous change. And in a lot of the advocacy work I've been doing over the last months, it's been very simple, just to explain to policymakers all of the lessons that we learnt in a very hard way under the previous system. Things like heart valves, hip implants, transvaginal mesh, lots and lots of things that were approved on the basis of equivalence and then had major public health concerns where it may not have just been one device, but a whole family of devices were unsafe to be marketed. I think that is one of the particular changes proposed where I would be concerned about the public health impact for that. But maybe leaving that to one side and thinking of what the future is looking like, we get some sense of the kind of way it's proposed that the system will run as a result of these revisions. So if we went back a year ago, all of the stakeholder groups were advocating for a captain of the ship or for a clear revision of the governance structure, because like we talked about earlier, you have the medical device coordination group, notified body coordination group, competent authority medical device network, 13 working groups under MDCG, 27 authorities, 55 notified bodies. This needs greater strategic direction. My hope for the system would be that in 5 or 10 or 15 years that the EU medical device regulators could write a strategy and publish one. We have strategies for medicines and the regulatory system there. We're not able to form a strategy for medical devices because there's no one to form one. We need to figure out these kind of things because the challenges that we saw with MDR were significant for the sector. So unless we have a strategy, it's very hard for all of us to get behind it and point at a North Star. What is changing is that there will be, I guess, it'll be the same general governance system. So it'll still be the medical device coordination group. They will have some greater scientific and technical support from the European Medicines Agency. So their remit is being expanded a little bit, and they will have new opportunities to do things like help national authorities with some pre-market studies, help answer safety questions or questions raised by the regulators to the EMA, and some very new ones like helping with classification disputes. To get a formal classification opinion goes through something called the Helsinki procedure that has over 30 procedural steps and can take up to 2 years to get an answer. Now, expert panel members are clinicians, so they're not people well versed in Annex 8 of the MDR and its interpretation. So it's kind of interesting that they're brought in as a arbitrator when member states disagree. But I think in general, it's a good direction that we're looking to get more organized scientific support to this regulatory system. So it'll all come down to how it's implemented and do we get these channels communicating with each other and working effectively. So that's entirely contingent on implementation rather than exactly what wording you have in the law. But I think that could potentially set us on a more scientific and clear path in some scenarios, but we'll have to see. I think that in general, for the notified bodies is going to be quite difficult. The proposed changes to get rid of 5-year reassessments, to have lots of things considered well-established technologies where you can do sampling rather than individual file assessments. The cumulative nature of the changes proposed for notified bodies will knock out a lot of their current income. So they're likely to shrink in the coming years. What will the effect of that be? Will it reduce in, longer wait times or internal changes causing a more chaotic conformity assessment? We'll have to see. It's very difficult to know. But it'll be very interesting to watch because notified bodies were much bigger in number under the directives. I think the highest number of notified bodies in the system was something like 93. So it was a huge amount. It's now at 55. But over the last years with MDR, notified bodies have been growing every year. This is the first year they're getting smaller. So when you think of some of the public discussion when there were lots of staff removed from the US FDA under their various policy approaches, it was interesting to see how much industry wanted to keep the in-house knowledge at FDA. Because industry, regardless of pharma or medtech or whatever, they value knowing that if you've had an assessment previously and you know what that assessor thinks, that's much better for you as a
It's
company.
predictability. Yeah.
Exactly. So we may have changes of that nature where your previous assessor might be gone, or might be a new team, or
Right.
or a different kind of approach. And I think, one of the interesting hypotheses that we'll have to see is, to what extent do all of these changes actually support competitiveness and innovation? Um, I see companies at the very nascent stage, where they're not even yet a company. It's maybe a concept, prototype, getting into preclinical. Um, and when I think of all of the changes in MDR, the majority of them tend to only come in at much later life cycle stages.
Right.
So are we going to actually turn people's thinking, who might have been considering market access in the US first, to thinking of EU first? That's an open question for me so far. If you're an orphan or a breakthrough type device, you might go for the kinds of supports here. But from my experience, since the revision was published in December, until now, from talking to these early stage companies, they still value the clarity of the US system compared to the EU
Right.
one. So our essential battle in Europe is that we set up these rules originally in the 1990s in rather abstract terms. That's the wording from Norbert Anselman, who was the principal officer in the European Commission responsible for the first medical device directive. So the original design was to write the rules in abstract terms. And it's very difficult to then, 30 years later, bring clarity into a system that's developed 30 years of habits of working within abstract terms, justifications, rationales, and those kinds of ways of documenting things. So I think that's going to be the challenge when, in the 21st century, a new developer needs clarity of evidence requirements. And when Europe has been designed from its origins to be vague on requirements, how do you try and resolve that?
Right.
And where are the most valuable places to try and resolve that? I think if we could figure out a strategy for that, that would really be how you truly support innovation in the system. And given the nature of the European system, authorities, notified bodies, but also funders, and also the people at hospital sites who run studies, and all of the support organizations who help with that, we're going to have to figure out, you won't be able to change everything, but we'll have to try and find a few meaningful areas where clarity is most impactful, and try and deliver it there. But I think that's our essential problem that we'll still be faced with after these revisions, is the freedom of abstract terms, but the tyranny of not having confidence that it'll work perfectly. Yeah.
Doesn't sound like an easy challenge to solve. Would you, from your time on in different parties, what would you, if you had the power to say, would be the best policy decision or general structure to enact? Would it be entirely abolishing the notified body concept, unifying everything across Europe? Is it fine-tuning? Is it providing more guidance? Where would you say is the best way, or where do you see the strongest leverage to use to change the system?
Yeah. So if I had the choice, but acknowledging the realpolitik of it, I think there's been a few debates over the years about abolishing notified bodies, and back around 2012, I think, was one of the strongest attempts, when there was actually, resolutions of the European Parliament that we should have an agency for medical devices. It probably wouldn't be feasible now, given just the size of notified bodies, like 6,000 staff in them, 1,000 clinical assessors. No one is going to pay to replace that in a public setting somewhere. So it has just grown to such an extent that abolishing notified bodies is just not politically feasible. But if we were to make discrete changes that would be most impactful, I would recommend that we take an approach similar to the United States for new high-risk products. So like the pre-market authorization with rigorous clinical evidence requirements, but for a small number of therapeutic implants that are new and coming into our system. The number of devices going through that pathway in the US is like 35 per year. we could distill out those 35 devices where getting it wrong would have major public health implications, and treat them rigorously. That would leave you the space to treat the medical equipment in the messy middle much more liberally. You could figure out by working well with standards communities how to try and make standards work for those class 2 devices, exactly like Theodore Cooper recommended in 1969. And for class 1, it would be much easier. So I think that's one of the key things that we could do, is treat the small number of high-risk therapeutic implants rigorously. And that would allow you to justifiably develop more focused things for middle-risk products where preclinical can have good evidence in some cases, or you might need to complement it with clinical evidence, but not a full, enormous study in others. But beyond that, the other change I would recommend is that we recognize what has changed in the last 20 years, which is that the dynamic of introduce it in Europe, do a very small study, CE mark, generate revenue, and then go for the US, that has changed. And if regulators want to keep up with the real world strategies that are applied currently in this day and age, we need to recognize that early clinical clarity is one of the most important things you can do, or early scientific clarity for some kinds of technologies, like is an in-silico model acceptable for this context of use, or something like that. If we could recognize that and apply that from a single source, giving clear advice, and it wouldn't need a huge complement of staff, but it would need some, I think that would be enormously beneficial, because then you would be able to say to the new developers I meet all the time, instead of just going to FDA for a pre-sub, why don't you talk to these people for a pre-sub, get clarity, it'll be written down, recorded somewhere, and you can proceed. I think that's probably one of the other most important things we could do to support new product introduction in a safe way. And for all of this, we need a much better focus on methods, because that has just been underappreciated because of the just CE marking nature of the system. It's all about conformity, and we don't talk yet about data or methods, and we need to. So I guess that's one of the other undervalued things that we need to put some focus on. And there's huge amounts of research and recommendations already available, but we have to find out the governance framework and the change in mentality that would allow us to think about that rather than just reinterpreting the law all the time, or these kind of approaches we currently have.
Do you have confidence that we can, I don't even want to stay relevant and stay competitive, but regain competitiveness and regain relevance on the global stage from a medical device, let's say, development and invention perspective? Do you have confidence that we can do that given the framework of policies that we operate in and the speed in which they develop in the direction?
Yeah, I think we have a quite fertile early innovation system in Europe. Lots of new product ideas. There's a high attrition rate, obviously, but lots of new things happening in Europe. I think where there's great opportunities to improve things, we mentioned early regulatory clarity, but things like you want to do a multi-site or multi-state clinical investigation in Europe, that can be an enormous body of work. To get a sign-off from 5 member states, from their authority and their ethics, and data protection that could be different in many places, and then contracts. To make Europe more attractive for translational development, we have to start to make some of these processes more combined and clearer. That doesn't mean, mixing your authority and ethics into one single committee and that'll answer for all of Europe. I don't think people are ready to move in that kind of a way yet. But there's lots of simple things that we could do that would help to save months on preparation work. So some work I did over the last year in Galway was something we call the Hypercare Initiative. And we took 3 developers, large multinational, a US small company, an Irish small company, and they had an early feasibility, a randomized trial, and an observational study. And we tried to bring them through the authority and ethics and your site approvals and contract. So it was up to the stage of enrollment, to see, without changing anything in the law, but if we had more openness and more discussions between the different people, we could find process efficiencies. And we found some, quite simple ones, like your data protection impact assessment. A couple of years ago in Ireland, if you had 5 hospitals in a study, each one would have their own data protection impact assessment, and sometimes each hospital would go to its own local lawyer for an opinion on it, and then you lose months and months and months. So we made a national policy decision that just the one data protection impact assessment from the sponsor is enough and doesn't have to be repeated. Or things like starting your contract preparation with the hospital site whilst you're undergoing your authority and ethics assessment can save you 3 months, which when you're thinking for startups and their cash burn, they can be important things. But I think there's a lot of quite boring things that could be made much more efficient that would improve the attractiveness of Europe in general. I'm not so involved in the funding world, but I think that, if you're talking competitiveness, that's essentially what you're talking. You have to attract funding to do these kind of things. And from talking to people based in the US, I think that it wasn't necessarily any individual problem with MDR, but the sentiment that grew around it, that because of MDR, don't go near Europe. I think that puts a duty on everyone involved in the system to find the better solutions, but also explain what's happening in Europe better. Because impressions from the United States can be very general, but also quite poor on the MDR. And if you think of, there hasn't been huge changes for pre-market studies with the medical device regulation, but I've heard lots of founders say, oh, MDR, we're not going near Europe for our study. So, well, not much change for pre-market studies. You can still come here. MDR doesn't, cause a huge change for these kind of things. So I think there's a lot of explanation that we need to do internationally, as well as working on some of the, simple but boring challenges that slow up research. And beyond that, I think, I did see a shift over the last years where the CE mark used to mean access, or pretty much access, to maybe 110 countries worldwide. But when I looked at it over the not formally, but just anecdotally, there's a number of countries that went from just accepting the CE mark to CE and FDA, or just FDA. So these competitive influences of our system's relevance are getting quietly more important. So I think that we have an important public relations job to do, and hopefully that will help with some of the challenges we saw with MDR. But above all of that, international harmonization is talked about when you go to all of these international medical device regulatory meetings. And there are some things happening now. If you look at the United Kingdom, for example, they're going to start accepting FDA-approved or CE-marked devices, which would be a very interesting test case to see how that works in that country. And there was a similar movement in Switzerland over the last years where they were thinking about doing that. And then lots of countries, outside of Europe would have that kind of a system anyway. There is no rational reason as to why a heart valve in the US or a heart valve in the EU should have quite different clinical evidence, quite different regulatory assessments, quite different evidence publicly disseminated. But I don't see very real movements to try and bring those kind of things closer together. The kind of things that you can do outside of a formal political intervention is a bit like our hypercare, is just getting people talking to one another. So an example that regulators did in the last 20 years was something called harmonization by doing. FDA people would have worked with PMDA people in Japan for things like heart valves for pediatrics or things like that. So there's lots of things under the hood of a big political change where you get shared experience. And it was interesting to see just this week, MHRA and the US FDA will be swapping staff, putting people into each other's offices for a while. So these things help to share experience, and that's how regulators realize that, oh, you're doing things very differently to how we seem to do things. So we need, probably better political attention on the value of international harmonization. We shouldn't be competing on ease to market or the quickest or cheapest or whatever way to get a CE mark versus a 510K. We should be competing on the value of what you can do for translational development between the two ecosystems. That would be a nice way to compete. When it's a regulatory competition, it becomes quite political and quite complicated, but doesn't tend to serve anyone very well. Companies have double work. Patients have potentially different levels of protection. So it doesn't work for anyone that's currently maintained. But I think if we can do some little things under the hood, like sharing experience and sharing cases, maybe it's something like orphan devices or something could be a nice test bed to trial some of those things. So maybe after we finish with our legislative focus this year, there could be some things like that in the future that would be very nice. But I think it's a
Mm.
longer arc of development. So yeah, I guess we talked about a couple of things there. You know, to me, I think the change for equivalence is one of the most publicly, in terms of public health challenges, it's one of the most significant. One thing I didn't mention is that, I've done a lot of work with clinical and diagnostic groups through Biomed Alliance over the last year, and especially for the IVD regulation and the diagnostic community, being able to prepare IVDs in-house is hugely important to them. So there was some promising changes with the revision to the IVD regulation to allow, in-house IVDs to be transferred between health institutions when there's no CE mark device available and a public health need. This is exactly what happened with COVID. There were no COVID tests in the early months of COVID.
Right.
They were all in-house devices. But if you can only share a written protocol for how to prepare it at your hospital, depending on the IVD, sometimes you could do it much, much faster if you could share reagents or share other materials rather than just a written protocol. So I think this would be really helpful for rare diseases where it may be almost half of the available devices in a hospital lab, but they're used less than 2% of the time.
Mm.
Again, it's a rare disease challenge, or for things like companion diagnostics, personalized medicine. It really has a lot of potential to help there because I think the pipeline for introduction of IVDs is very different to medical devices. They can often start in a hospital lab and then they later translate to CE mark devices. So there's a lot that we could do to support innovation or new IVD development, in that
Mm.
kind of way. So it's a proposal currently in the revision, but we'll have to see if it works its way through the legislative process. Yeah.
Right. Right. So that I think it's very nice, and it sort of ends us here on a very nice note. It seems that from this legislative change and also what you mentioned in terms of exchange of staff between FDA and MHRA, or cross-functional development in general, um, that these are ways to really show, okay, there can be movement in the system, and can move forward. Is there anything else you would want to shout out in terms of, let's say, regulatory movements that give you hope that things can change and do change also for the better, despite all of the hurdles that we discussed today?
Hmm. Um, well, yeah, there's lots of challenges, but things certainly do give me hope. I forget who said it, but there was a wonderful quote by someone who said that small groups of people coming together can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that tends to change the world. And when I think of things like the orphan device challenge, this was small groups of people coming together, realizing there's a problem and doing their
Mm.
best to try and make things work. And since then, we've had some EU-funded research projects where, for the first time, the EU was trying to fund how do we better establish researchers or networks. And I was in one project called Decode, developing child and orphan devices, and we got to have mentoring sessions with 5 product developers. And seeing how getting just a small number of people who know about regulation or clinical methods or outcomes or whatever together, working with these new product developers could really help them to get clear on how do we get this product through a study or introduced into the market. And
Mm.
they were often very simple things, something like a simple walker for a child with a neurodegenerative condition. It could be engineers in an academic setting who've developed it and they've no idea of regulation at all. You could really help strengthen their translational development by telling them some of the important things they need to think about. So there's lots of hope in the system, as well as lots of challenges. But I think it's by coming together and getting people working together, even in small, tiny little groups, and trying to grow it. I think that's how you try and get things done.
Awesome. Thank you, Dom, for sharing so much insights in your perspective, your perspectives, plural, on clinical research. I love your enthusiasm. I love that you are here to, despite the challenges that you have seen from within the system, push for change, to push for more science in the regulations, to sort of like flip the system a bit on its head and sort of like work from the need for evidence backwards and how we can provide more guidance towards that. Really appreciate it. Thank you for coming by. It was really lovely catching up, and I'm sure we could talk for another hours and will. And I'm sure there'll be another opportunity to connect to upcoming news, changes in regulations. Should MDR 2.0 come over, we should certainly have you here and dig really into it again.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Andreas. It was a really nice talk.
It was a pleasure.